First You Think is a not-for-profit ministry of the First Unitarian Church of Des Moines. Support us at ucdsm.org today.
Good morning to everyone. I'm Al Powers. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I hope to give you a little information this morning on my history and my present beliefs. We all have our own story of how we became a UU, and while many of us have a very similar history, every story is unique. And I've always enjoyed hearing those stories. I am honored to be able to share some of my story with you this morning. I hope to give you some idea of my current beliefs and what I feel is important in my life today. Well, I grew up as a pretty normal Midwestern kid on a small farm just east of Carlisle. A bit geekier than most, but all in all, pretty normal. I have a very early memory of attending the Christian, that is, Disciple of Christ Christian Church in Carlisle when I was probably 4 or 5 years old. But after that, I didn't have any church-going experience until late elementary or maybe even early junior high age. At that point, I started attending a nearby rural church, which just happened to be a Friends or Quaker church congregation, mainly because that's where all the neighbors went, and I could catch a ride along with my cousin who lived just up the road from me. Eventually, my mother also started attending that church, and that became my first real church experience. I liked the Sunday school. I liked the youth meetings that we had on Sunday evening, but it was really more of a social event than it was a church experience. I did, however, become a very active participant in the church, and I remember receiving a 5-year perfect attendance pin at one point for being there every Sunday. Eventually, I became the Sunday school treasurer and, again, was very active in the whole organization. I liked the Bible classes. I was a good student of the Bible, enjoyed reading and learning about it, and I tried hard to understand and to appreciate the religious message that the church was teaching. But despite my involvement and my attempts at believing, I never felt the personal connection to a God that the minister and others talked about. Again, I liked the Bible stories, but I just never accepted them as being literally true. They seemed to me to be a story, a legend. I really didn't see the need to send out missionaries to save the world. But mostly I kept those things to myself, and I certainly never shared my doubts with anyone else in the church. My first serious struggle with religious beliefs was when I was old enough to officially join the church. I remember rather distinctly when at the end of our membership class, our pastor took each of us individually into the basement kitchen and asked us privately if we accepted Jesus as our personal Savior. Well, of course, I said yes, while at the same time wondering what all the other kids had said and thinking that this just doesn't make much sense to me, and really wondering what the adults in the church were thinking. I made that same declaration publicly during the joining ceremony, and again, all the time just wondering, what am I doing here? Well, my church attendance came to an abrupt halt partway through my senior year in high school when I took a job as a weekend radio announcer for what was then Des Moines Country Music Station. My religious education continued, however, because the station ran a full Sunday morning schedule of religious programming. I started Sunday morning at 7 o'clock with a scratchy tape from a local person called the Sunshine Lady. And then that was followed by services from a couple of local churches and from several of the national programs. This experience certainly added to my overall feeling about organized religion and contributed to my continued concern, if you could call it that. I soon learned that the main goal, at least from my view, of several of the most popular national programs was to get the listeners to send in money. That seemed to be their main theme. I was also amazed when one of the preachers that I had always considered to be top-notch proclaimed that the moon landing was all a hoax. I don't remember why he thought God wouldn't allow us to go to the moon. But somehow that just seems so contrary to logical thinking that I just couldn't believe they were really preaching it. I also remember being warned that one of the local pastors had a habit of going into a prayer shortly before his time was up, with the idea that we would never cut him off in the middle of a prayer. I couldn't believe that he would actually do that on purpose, but I was wrong. By the time I graduated from college and gave up the weekend announcing job, I was basically indifferent toward religion. I still thought of myself as a Christian, and I firmly believed in part of the church's teaching about we are all responsible for helping others. It was just the part about this eternal life and being saved just because you believed in Jesus that I just couldn't connect with. Even more disturbing to me was the idea that every particular religion declared that its beliefs were right and that all of the others were wrong. Well, I didn't get back to regular church attendance until my oldest kid was probably 7 or 8 years old, and I felt that she needed to have that church experience. By then, my mother had moved from the local Friends Church back to the Christian Disciples of Christ Church in Carlisle, and so that's where I started to go with my kids. I quickly became engaged in that church community, wound up teaching Sunday school, serving on the board, finally became a deacon and then an elder of the church, and you might be surprised that I became the caretaker of the building. So even though I was quite active in the church and in the church life, I was really considered one of the leaders of the congregation. I personally qualified my participation by being very selective about what parts of the program I believed and what parts I just kind of set aside. I still had not decided that I wasn't a Christian, mainly because I didn't know of any other options. I believed, however, that if there was a God, he was not a personal force in my life or a being that I would ever interact with. In general, I thought that the church community provided a valuable organization for support of its members and that it was doing a good job in and for the broader community. I felt that I could support the church's position on social issues and could at least tolerate its position on world affairs, even if I didn't understand the need to convince the whole world to become Christian. A crack in that acceptance came when the chair of the elders suggested that we should study the biblical position on capital punishment. I thought that was a great idea, as I had always been opposed to the use of capital punishment, probably since early high school. It wasn't long, however, before I realized that he and all of the other elders thought that the Bible supported and justified the death penalty, and that our church should make a public statement to that effect. I just couldn't accept that as possibly being a rational, reasonable position for the church to take. But even with that and other similar concerns, I continued with my roles in the church. After being divorced and finding myself a single father with 2 kids, I found the church to be even more important, both for me and for the kids. I was still active in that Christian church when I met Anne in the summer of 1988. She had been a UU for some time and a member of the Des Moines First Unitarian for several years. She invited me to come to a Sunday service with her shortly after we met. Well, I use the term service rather loosely because at that time, the church basically shut down for the summer, and instead we had what was termed patio church, where members provided a forum or discussion during the church period. Well, you might want to ask her about this, but I learned later that she arranged for this because she thought that was going to end everything. And she didn't want to waste time, with me if there was no future in this. Well, that particular morning, Des Bragg was talking. Now, if any of you remember Des Bragg, you remember his one and only interest in life? He talked about UFOs. And I thought it was great. So I remember talking to Anne about our beliefs over lunch that day. And she asked me kind of the standard question of how could I possibly believe that it was only people who, believed and professed a belief in Jesus that would be saved. And my immediate response was, that's really not what I believe. And that I felt there were other religions that were probably just as valid as Christianity. Well, I don't remember much else about that conversation, but we decided that maybe we weren't quite as far apart as she had expected. And obviously, she stuck with me after that. That was the beginning, but it took a couple more years to complete my transition to being a UU. I became a member of the church in 1990, shortly after Ann and I were married, and I soon felt that this was exactly where I belonged. As Bill said last week, and we didn't even actually coordinate this, I just felt that I'd been a UU all my life. I just didn't know it, didn't know about it, and couldn't express it that way. But I really felt that I should have been here all the time. Well, I had never heard the term humanist before joining the UU Church, but I soon learned that the modern humanist movement started in the Midwest and that our Des Moines church had been a significant force in that movement. Many of the people that I first connected with at this church were strong humanists. The church services and the activities presented a humanist viewpoint that I found natural and easy to relate to. Once I was comfortable saying that I was a UU, it wasn't long before I also decided that I was a humanist. It took a little longer, but I finally overcame that ingrained belief that I had to be a Christian, and finally that being a UU humanist was all that I needed. Today, I consider myself a secular humanist within the UU fellowship. My understanding of secular humanism is a philosophy that applauds reason, ethics, and justice, and specifically rejects supernatural forces. This translates into looking out for humanity and for our world, because that's all we have, and we had better make the most of it and make it last. It requires the application of reason and science to the understanding of the universe and the solving of human problems. I have a strong belief that we each need to do all that we can to help our fellow humans and to ensure that the world will be here for future generations. My position on God today is basically it doesn't really matter. I don't see any evidence and don't have any feeling that there is a personal God that we can interact with. I think it is also most likely that the universe was created by purely physical processes, but if we eventually find evidence that there's in some way some God that was responsible, I think I'll be able to accept that also. I really believe in humanity and in our place in the universe. I don't know why we are here, other than being the end result of a long and random series of processes that obey the laws of physics and chemistry. I don't believe that we have any special place in the universe or that the universe provides any purpose for our being. I do, however, believe that life is very special and precious, and that this earth is the only home that we have, at least for the foreseeable future. It is our responsibility to keep this earth in a living condition for us and for the coming generations. This basic concept that we as the human race are responsible for our own well-being and that of our children leads me directly to a number of fundamental UU tenets. The first, to me, is the respect for the worth and dignity of each individual. Every person, every life is precious and deserves the basic freedoms and rights that make life worthwhile. We also need to respect the interdependent web. We do not and cannot live in isolation. Everything that we do affects every living creature. If we don't respect and take care of that relationship, the earth will not be able to sustain humanity and our population. I am especially concerned today about our using up all of our natural resources to produce energy and believe strongly that we must develop a long-term program of sustainable energy production. I also believe strongly that we have a moral and ethical responsibility to do good. This is probably my deepest belief, but also the hardest for me to explain or to even understand. It goes back to the idea that we are each responsible for making the world a better place. I believe that there are fundamental rules that apply to everyone, that we are to be good and do good just because it's the right thing to do. I don't see this as a path to future rewards. I just see it as our duty and responsibility to our earth, and our reward is that life for someone that we touch might be a little better. I believe that education and knowledge, whether purely scientific, applied technology, art, or music, are all inherently good and desirable because they are the tools that we need to understand and use to interact with the world and to advance our civilization. It is our skills, abilities, and knowledge that allow us to leave this world a little better place than when we found it. It is also through learning that we can formulate our own answers to the religious questions that we all share and wonder about. Recognizing that we don't have the absolute answer to a lot of questions doesn't make them any less important or any less worthy of our efforts and thoughts. I believe that we each have a responsibility to our community. That responsibility is to participate in whatever way our individual abilities and circumstances will allow, but to do it as constructively as possible so that we strengthen and improve our culture, our educational, and our social structures. All of that brings me to the title of my talk, Life is a Relay Race. We don't start from zero, but we begin with the product of thousands of years of civilizations that preceded us. And our contribution doesn't end when we die. We just hand it off to the next generation that will follow. One of my favorite lines is from the song that I asked Bruce to play during the offering. In case you didn't hear Louis Armstrong singing in the background, as Bruce played, the last verse of that song says, "I hear babies cry, I watch them grow. They'll learn much more than I'll ever know." And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. My beliefs have moved gradually over the past 35 years from a rather selective Christian viewpoint to my current humanist understanding of the world. I believe that humanism provides a better alternative than the mainstream religions, Christian or otherwise. Being a humanist in the UU tradition allows me to use my talents and resources to improve our world, and it satisfies my need to be a part of a community. It also allows me to look at the world in a rational manner without having to resort to supernatural forces to explain or to justify what I know is inherently right and what we should be doing with our lives. I am grateful for the people who have supported and maintained the humanist tradition and our church. I hope that I can contribute to that tradition and can pass it on to the next generation. May we keep our UU and our humanist beliefs and traditions alive and available for future generations.